Welcome to Beyond Death, a podcast that is rewriting the conversation about death, covering a range of topics in the death space and celebrating the wonderful and amazing people that work in this arena and hearing their stories and their experiences. And we are your hosts. I'm Lindsay. I'm a forensic radiographer, and I'm also a radiographer of many years' experience. And we also have with us today, we have
Oh, hi, I'm Mark. I'm also a radiographer and a forensic radiographer, and I'm a lecturer in forensic radiography. So, Lindsay, who do we have with us today?
well, we are very, very lucky to have Kerry Daynes with us today. Hi, Kerry. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm very good because I'm talking to you, so it's a lovely way to spend the morning.
Well, thank you very much, and happy festivities whilst we're at it, because we're in the middle of December. None of us are wearing any Santa hats, I have to say. So very welcome to you indeed, because we don't often get to talk to writers and broadcasters and someone with your experience in forensic psychology. So for us, forensic radiographers, it's just slightly out on the left field, which we're really excited about. Um, what I'd like to do first of all, before I hand over to you, is to read your biography, um, if you don't mind. So,
Go for
Kerry,
it.
I will. Kerry Daynes is the UK's best known and most trusted forensic psychologist. With nearly 30 years spent as one of the most sought after professionals in the business, her job is to delve into the psyche of those who come into conflict with the law. Meeting everyone from serial killers to shoplifters, her work has taken her from police interview rooms and the witness box to the cells of maximum security prisons and wards of secure hospitals. Her remarkable career has also made her the go-to psychology expert for true crime audiences around the globe. Perhaps most recognised as the profiler on the UK and USA Discovery channels, Kerry appears and presents regularly on British and international television networks. Her memoir, The Dark Side of the Mind, was a Sunday Times bestseller, and the sequel, What Lies Buried, was listed for a Crime Writers Association Golden Dagger Award for non-fiction. So we're going to put a link into the podcast as well, Kerry, for your books,
Thank you.
so our audience can know a little bit more about what you've been writing. So I think the first question to you, even though I've read all that out, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into forensic psychology and how you got into writing and where how you got to where you are now.
Oh gosh, there's quite a lot in that. So I am a northerner, as you can probably pick up from the accent, so very working class background. And I was actually in St. Winifred's School Choir. Do you remember St. Winifred's School Choir? Are you old enough to remember them in the 80s?
Yes, they had a number one, didn't they?
They did. They knocked John Lennon off the number one spot, believe it or not. And yeah, with a song called "There's No One Quite Like Grandma." Yeah,
That's it.
much to my shame. So that was my background. So people say, well, how did this choir girl singing about love and peace and grandmas end up working in the field that I did? And it was almost by accident. I wanted to go into advertising and marketing. So I was told that a psychology degree was the thing to do. And then I joined up with law subsidiaries because all the best looking boys were in the law classes. And of course, I was 18 at the time. So, we make these decisions, don't we, based on raging hormones. So I got very interested in the law. And I thought, well, how can I marry law and psychology together? And forensic psychology was a fairly new discipline at that time. And of course, it had been popularized by Cracker with Robbie Coltrane. And of course, it's absolutely nothing like Cracker with Robbie Coltrane.
Mm.
But, it appeared on the radar, and I thought, right, that's what I'm going to be. So I started out working actually at Wakefield High Secure Prison, which was a baptism of fire, not necessarily for the reasons that you would expect. It was the prison officers that there were, that were the problem. And I did end up taking a prison officer to court for harassment. So that did not make me very popular on the landings. And I did wonder at that time if my career in forensic psychology was going to be very, very short-lived. But I moved into the forensic mental health sphere. So I think possibly the second person to train as a forensic psychologist, but within the NHS. So that for me was fantastic because I got to move away from the work that is done in prisons, which tends to be very, very prescriptive, uh, and and learn more about mental health and its interaction with crime and offending. So it worked very well for me. And from there, well, I don't know whether I've been very, very lucky or just rather chaotic, but I've worked in many different forensic settings. So in hospitals, prisons, in the community, in courtrooms, and also during the earlier part of my career with the police, because investigative psychology was new at that point as well. And so these days, if you are a investigative advisor, then you probably work for the police. But at that time, they used to ask forensic psychologists to come in and give advice, you know, for better or for worse. So I've just been incredibly privileged, really, to do the work that I've done. It's been varied, it's been interesting, it's been fascinating. It's been a bit of a roller coaster, my career. It's had ups and it's had downs, but it's nothing if not interesting. What do the Chinese say? You know, crisis is opportunity riding a dangerous wind, and that's always been the case for me, I think.
I think that sums up radiographers as well. I think in the work that we do, that's a really, and you obviously love what you do. I've got a sub question to that. So in the books that you've written, like The Dark Side of the Mind, you talk about you have insight into what makes criminals tick and how they might be more effectively treated. Do you see any changes in the system where where people are more effectively treated, or with the current lack of resources, do you see which way is this going?
Well, it's not just lack of resources, it's lack of care, really. And I think that this political populism, which we've seen with both major parties, when I went into psychology, well, when I went to university, it was 1992. Of course, we'd had the murder of James Bulger, and both political parties, it was an election year, they're vying for votes, both political parties wanting to show that they can be tough on crime. And this has persisted really throughout the 30 years that I've been a forensic psychologist. Everybody wants to show just how tough they are. So we're having more people sent to prison for longer and longer periods, but less and less investment in prison and probation services. So it's really not rocket science what we need, because other countries do it very, very well. So if you look at Scandinavian countries, they have very low reoffending rates, and they really do invest into their prisons and into their personnel. So they're highly trained, and the numbers are high. Whereas we've just not done this. We've allowed the criminal justice system to go to rack and ruin, across so many different areas. And now, of course, it's very difficult to try and repair the
Mm.
damage that has been done.
Yeah,
I
to put
went
the
into
steps
forensic.
back in,
Sorry?
to put the steps back in again, and it's also about prevention and education.
Of
You
course
know,
it is.
we don't invest, but that's a very political thing. But I just wondered if you had seen like being effective is very, very difficult now. I think that you're saying, isn't it, to prevent and to protect the public?
Exactly. And of course, if you are preventing crime, you are protecting the public. And I think that people think that if we spend money on prisoners or on offenders, then we're spending money on people that don't deserve it. And actually, if we're spending money on them, then we are helping to prevent new victims. So and just the environment as well. I mean, how can you do anything that is meaningful in terms of rehabilitation when you're in environments that are literally crumbling, decayed? There are rats in the corner. I've had my sandwiches eaten by unidentified beasties in prisons before now. Um, they're just, we're so behind other countries. And I think it's because we want to be seen as punitive and tough. And what I have always advocated for is what I call rational compassion. So compassion is very different to empathy, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't suggest that we feel sympathy or feel sorry for anybody who has committed an offence, but I do think that we should be compassionate, and I do think that we should take their rights into account whilst being realistic about what their risks are. And I don't think it's compassionate to lock people, six in a cell, maybe with a bed, maybe not. I've seen people sleeping on concrete floors before now.
Goodness
Um,
me. I bet you're
yeah,
you're needed more than ever then, Kerry, probably in this situations that demands on you more than ever.
possibly. I mean, I think my role after 30 years, because you do get a bit jaded after 30 years. I think my role now is talking about these issues. And I do an awful lot of lectures with school children, which I love because they love to hear a gory story, their kids. They want to hear all about psychopaths and, strange things I might have found in prison cells and who's done what to whom. But I always do it with this focus on rational compassion because they are the future. And if anybody's going to drag us out of this mess, it's going to be the next generation, I think. I think we're just firefighting at the moment and will be firefighting
Yeah, I
for a long
agree.
time.
So I'm just going to move on to the next question for you. How did you get connected with Anubix to do this podcast? I think you mentioned earlier that you went to a conference. Tell us all about that.
I did. I went to the British Association of Forensic Medicine conference, and they wanted me to talk about serial killers. So we actually talked about myths about serial killers that can get in the way of investigations, because of course police are not, you know, not made of stone, and they live in the same world as we do. And often, they believe the same kind of myths which are trotted out on TV as your layperson, and they can really get in the way. I'd just done a program about the Stephen Port case. Um, so of course, Stephen Port, who killed four men, and it really should never have got to that stage. He should have been caught with the first victim, who actually he just positioned outside of his flat. So he didn't really go to any great lengths to conceal what he'd done. But nevertheless, his victims were put down as young, uh, gay drug users. And the fact that they were gay, I think, really did feed into that stereotype, even though some of them had absolutely no history of drug use whatsoever. And so I was talking about myths, and we had some police there as well who were talking about investigations that had gone awry for whatever reason. And then, of course, we had loads of fascinating presentations from pathologists, and it was just so interesting for me to be in the room and be privy to that, because it's just not something that I'm normally, you know, it's not something that I'm normally involved in. Luckily, I've got a strong stomach, so I'm not easily shocked by postmortem photographs or anything like that. But it was great because there were so many links in the room. So there were pathologists that had worked on the investigations that either I knew well because I'd then gone on to work with the perpetrator, or I had covered in some way, in media or broadcast. So it was just fantastic to put it all together. It just felt like having a much more complete picture, really.
Yeah,
And
and
I'm all
that's how
about
we've
having
got
complete pictures.
and that's how we got to meet you. And I'm going to hand over to Mark now for the next question. So thanks, Kerry, for those.
I was just sort of looking through some of your writing, and I noticed that you say, particularly in your book, What Lies Buried, how you've met, some of the mad, the bad, and the dangerous. And I just wondered whether there were things about that work that you do that you don't like, and things that are difficult in meeting those people. How do you find that?
Oh gosh, loads, absolutely loads. Where do you want me to begin? I hate it when I see injustice. I think that I got into this field because I do have a very innate sense of justice. And I hate seeing when our system has made somebody worse than they need to be. So, for example, I've worked with Charles Salvador, who you might know as Charlie Bronson.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And you look at his history and talk to him, and you see where everything has gone wrong, his mental health difficulties, you know, his extreme paranoia was not recognized, trauma and just, you know, his lifestyle beforehand wasn't really taken into account. And he was brutalized in prison, really. You know, he was made worse than he is. He is currently still in a segregation block. He's not seen grass or put his, you know, feet on grass for over 35 years. And that I find really, really inhumane. So it's hard to see a life like that that didn't need to be like that if only we had approached him in a more creative and humane and, yes, compassionate way. And I'm not saying for a moment that all Charlie needs is a hug. You know, don't think that, you know, I'm going that far, but certainly a little bit of understanding and a psychological formulation of him earlier on, I think would have, you know, served everybody
Yeah.
in that situation. And when it came to writing my books, well, with the first book, I thought I'll write my story because, as I say, it has been a roller coaster. There's been ups and downs. But I also thought I would just write about the people that stuck out in my memory. And it was interesting because actually the people that stuck out in my memory were the ones that really graphically illustrated where the system goes terribly, terribly wrong, or where it's, you know, not equal justice for all. So I think that both books almost became somewhat of a manifesto, really, and that wasn't intended. Literally, I sat down at my dining table, my dining room table, where I am sitting now, started to type with one finger, but that's what the books became.
Right.
So you
Well,
do
they sort
remember.
of wrote themselves by the sound of it. It sounds to me that you were quite passionate about these issues, and that the books actually effectively wrote themselves because of the story that you
Well,
wanted to
they don't
tell and
quite write
the
themselves.
convey.
You know, I'm not a writer. Well,
Yeah,
I'm used to
but
writing reports for, you know, forensic
yes, yeah,
psychological
yeah,
assessments,
yeah,
and that's a
yeah.
very, very different thing. So I write as though I'm talking to a friend. I think that I got into the swing of it more with the second book, so there's more conversation in the second book. But yeah, I am just very, very passionate
Mm,
about these
mm,
things, and I think that if you write what you're passionate about, that comes through, doesn't it, in the writing?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
so, you know, I
and
see so many things that I find just shocking or terrible or difficult. You know, I wrote a chapter about working with a man who had raped an elderly woman who was both blind and learning disabled, and I had been involved in planning her interview.
wow.
Um, but then, you know, 15 years down the line, he becomes one of my patients. And, you know, that's quite difficult when you've worked
Yeah,
closely with a
yeah.
victim to then work with the
And
perpetrator.
how do you deal with that, the emotional side of that?
Well, the shock when I realized who it was, and when I first saw him, you know, I immediately thought, oh, I know who you are, and I know
Mm,
what you've done, you know, you bastard sort of thing.
mm,
Um, and I had to physically walk away and just, I think I locked myself in the loo and just had to think to myself, no, this is a human being that requires my help. I've got a job to do here. And I think it's all about really knowing yourself and understanding yourself and sitting with yourself for a moment and analyzing how you feel, so that then you are able to put that to one side and adopt a more professional approach.
mm, mm.
So, you know, I always try and think, what are my biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious? How am I feeling about this? And if I need to take myself out of a situation for 5 minutes and give myself a you know, a pep talk, then I do. And I imagine that you must have very, very similar
Yeah,
reactions.
interesting. I was just thinking as you were talking, it's very similar. You know, if you're doing post-mortem work, sometimes there are smells and sights and things that
Mm.
just make you stop for that second, rather like you were describing there, and you have to sort of just take yourself away from that and then say, right, this is, I'm doing a professional scientific job. I've just got to slightly distance myself from that and deal with
Yeah.
this person, and they're
Well,
still a person, whether they're dead or alive, and I have to be
absolutely.
respectful to them, and I have to, just do my job and just focus on what you're doing. But
Yeah.
yeah, very similar. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel for you in the smell department. But yes, I think as
Mm,
a forensic psychologist, if you're doing your work and you're doing it well, then you're going to come across the occasional bad
yeah.
smell, the occasional flea that's going to jump out
Yeah.
at you. I've had that from people's eyelashes, believe it or
Oh,
not,
lovely.
before now.
Yeah.
So yeah, you've got to be quite strong of stomach, really, I think, in these professions,
Definitely.
haven't you?
Definitely. That's very
And see
true
the
in
funny side
forensics.
of things.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got to have a sort of strange sense of humor. But,
Absolutely.
Lindsay, can I just hand back to you for a second?
Of course. Very interesting, Kerry. So, could you describe a situation that stayed with you and why? And I know that you touched on a couple of things there, but I wondered whether you could describe something that really did move you for good or bad or whatever.
Oh gosh, I mean, I'm trying to think. There's so many of them.
I bet.
With my books, I tell a story, and I must say that my books are not all about serial killers. Not everybody in my book has killed somebody. Because that's something that I do have a bit of a problem with, in media, that these are the stories that we tell, where there are so many other stories that are worth telling. And I tell a story about a man that I've named Gary, because of course I do change change things, including names, to protect the innocent and the not so innocent. And Gary was somebody with a learning difficulty who had committed a sexual assault on the back of a bus against a 13-year-old girl who was in a group of youths who had been taunting him, basically. Not that that excuses his behavior in any way, shape, or form, of course. Um, so it was an anger-driven sexual assault of this young girl on the back of the bus, which you don't often get sexual assaults on the back of the bus generally. Um, and he was an IPP sentence prisoner. So what that meant is that he'd been sentenced under a now defunct um, law that was brought in, I think, by oh, who was it? Is it David Blunt? Is that the right politician,
Could
or have I
be.
got that wrong? I
Don't
think
worry.
so.
Mm.
Um, and it meant that he was imprisoned for public protection, so he had an indefinite sentence. And I've seen people go into prison for what should have been, 2 years and then still be there 17 years later because of this IPP sentence, because it's actually very difficult to prove that you're not a risk whilst you are in a prison environment. So it was a very, very uh, uh, unfair law, which has been challenged recently, but there are still IPP prisoners out there. And I was meant to be assessing Gary, and every time I tried to assess him, he was not available, usually because he'd received a good beating in prison from somebody, because his behavior was totally disinhibited. He was mooning the other prisoners, which sounds silly, but it's not going to make friends for you in a jail. And he also would grab other prisoners' food and eat it. And he didn't want to be separated from a Sainsbury's bag for life. You know, one of these orange ones with an elephant on it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
because it was a bag for life. And so, as far as he was concerned, you needed this bag for life. And I think that his bag had been replaced several times by his mother. But of course, this was causing problems because you can't wander around with a Sainsbury's bag in a jail either. So, and he would kick up a real fuss when his bag was taken away from him or damaged in some way, shape, or form. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I really had to search for his for his background information and his medical notes. I always go after medical notes, and most people will go into jail and their medical notes should follow, but they don't. And it emerged that actually Gary had a brain tumor that had been diagnosed shortly before he'd gone into jail, but it had never been disclosed and it had never been followed up. So an awful lot of his behavior was to do with where this tumor was centered in his brain. And he did have emergency surgery, and he did well for the first couple of weeks and then died in the third week. So I remember going to visit Gary's mum, who had helped me out with a lot of information. Yeah. And Gary at that point was basically in an urn. So he was in an urn, and his urn was placed in a Sainsbury's bag for life. And I mean, do you get any more pathos than that? I really don't know. So every time I see a Sainsbury's bag for life, I think about Gary, and a lot of other people do as well who have,
of course you do.
Yeah, read the book, and I think that that chapter obviously brought in all about IPP sentences and just how wrong they are, basically, but also the impact
Indeed.
of
and what a vulnerable,
Sorry?
Yeah, I was going to say what a vulnerable person he was.
Oh gosh, yeah, absolutely. And of course you'd think, oh well, this is somebody who has sexually assaulted a 13-year-old girl. We've got no empathy or sympathy for him, and we shouldn't have, but we should have compassion for him. And I think that people did after they read the chapter of my book, because people write to me all the time and say, I often think about Gary when I see that elephant or when I see that orange bag. So things like that can't help but stay with you.
Yeah, no, I have heard of these. Kerry, that is just so interesting, and it's been absolutely wonderful to hear your answers to our evasive questions, as it were. So I'm going to say we're going to wrap up now. We're going to wrap this episode of Beyond Death, and I'm going to go over to Mark to say, what have we learned from Kerry today, Mark?
What did we learn? Well, we've learned a huge amount. Firstly, I've learned what happens to people who were in St Winifred's School Choir after they were in St Winifred's School Choir, and what amazing lives they've led since then. And it's been really interesting hearing your experiences, Kerry. And I think we've had a really wide-ranging debate, really about crime and criminals, and the fact that society sort of has tended to just put them in a prison, lock them away, and not want to deal with them. And actually, we need to have that humane compassion. And sometimes some of those criminals, perhaps an early intervention, an early understanding of the people they are, would really help rehabilitate them and make society a much better place. So it's been really, really interesting to speak to you, Kerry. I'm certainly not going to be able to look at a Sainsbury's bag for life quite in the same way ever again, I don't think. And I can understand how that must trigger things in your mind as well. But thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that concludes today's conversation. And remember, if you enjoy the episodes, please follow us and rate our channel. And we're always keen to improve on feedback from listeners. And once again, thank you, Kerry, for a most illuminating talk. I know that our listeners will be very interested in the work that you've been doing. But remember, although this concludes today, it's not the end, because there's always more beyond death.